found herself in a dark world of sex trafficking and prostitution, a life she never knew she'd be involved in. Graphic images were taken of her and placed on the internet against her will. She was forced to perform sexual favors multiple times every day throughout Dallas, surrounding areas. Escape was not easy. She was cut off from her family. A boyfriend turned pimp limited her phone calls to John's and did not allow her to have money. But somehow she found an opportunity to get away, and she never looked back. After many years of living in silence, Kathy decided to journal her experience. The journal became a book, which became a stage play. Kathy found her voice and is now an inspirational speaker who hopes to use her story to encourage others to join the fight. Images of Kathy's horrific past linger on. She says, sites like Backpage have chosen to re-victimize survivors and keep us in bondage by refusing to remove images taken against our will. Kathy hopes that one day the voices of survivors will be heard. Well, we hear you today, Kathy. Congress hears you. We hear the voices of the victims remain in physical and mental bondage. So in conclusion, let me say, as we hear the voices of the survivors, we realize the importance of our First Amendment and the ability to free expression. But we know that the torment that these victims are going through, the PTSD that they're suffering, really is a statement of importance for H.R. 1865 that allows states and victims to fight online sex trafficking and to work with all of those who have worked so hard on this bill, from our Judiciary Committee to the Senate Judiciary Committee to the sponsors, and to go forward building on this legislation, more victims being able to work with us, and finally, Mr. Chairman, to be able to stomp out, extinguish human trafficking, sex trafficking, online trafficking. This is a powerful nation. There is no reason why we cannot do this. I look forward to that effort, and with that, I ask for a vote of yes on this bill, and I want to say that Mrs. Maloney, who sounded as if she said vote no, really meant to say that she wants a resounding yes on this legislation as well. With that, I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I again want to thank my colleague, Ann Wagner, for all of her hard work on this very, very important piece of legislation. It's our responsibility here in Congress to provide the strongest, most effective tools possible to confront, punish, and ultimately prevent the horrific nightmare that is human sex trafficking. For far too long, we have seen a stark rise in the use of the internet to buy and sell trafficking victims and minors for sex. This sick industry has been allowed to prosper because, due to broad interpretation of existing law, there have been no serious legal consequences for websites that turn a profit by selling human beings. Today, it is incumbent upon us to stop this horrifying injustice by passing H.R. 1865 to finally give prosecutors the tools they need to crack down on sites that promote and participate in the human sex trade. I call on all my colleagues to support this legislation today and to send a clear message that we will no longer tolerate this evil, atrocious behavior, and we will no longer be complicit in letting these bad actors get away with these hateful crimes against humanity. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. It shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary printed in the bill. The committee amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. No amendment to the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in House Report 115-583. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debated for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in House Report 115-583. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 115-583, offered by Mr. Goodlatte of Virginia.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 748, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as it may consume.
One is recognized.
This amendment makes small but important changes to this bill. Most significantly, the bill narrows the class of defendants covered in the new Section 2421A, which criminalizes the deliberate promotion or facilitation of prostitution. As the creation of this law is designed to target bad actor websites, this amendment narrows defendants covered to those who own, manage, or operate an interactive computer service with the intent to promote or facilitate prostitution. This amendment avoids creating a broad federal law that covers conduct that is not necessarily federal in nature. Second, the manager's amendment strikes language from the underlying bill's civil recovery provision that was intended to encourage victims to successfully plead their cases. However, the language could have created a risk of confusion by the courts, and so it has been removed. Further, the manager's amendment clarifies that mandatory restitution provision is only applicable to victims of sex trafficking, not to those who voluntarily have engaged in prostitution. Finally, the manager's amendment adds language inadvertently omitted from the original bill, which permits defendants who face an aggravated charge for promoting or facilitating more than 5 people to assert the statute's affirmative defense. If a defendant can prove that advertisements were targeted to a locality where promotion or facilitation is legal. Mr. Chairman, this manager's amendment is the product of the Judiciary Committee's repeated and thoughtful effort to produce a workable and technically sound piece of legislation. This bill will do a great deal to protect victims of sex trafficking. I am proud of the hard work by my colleagues and staff to ensure that the criminal law is appropriately tailored to achieve that goal, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas rise?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to claim the time in opposition, although I am not opposed to the amendment.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I rise to support the Goodlatte amendment, and I thank the chairman, along with our ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for their hard work and working together. I think this amendment is particularly important because it clarifies that the restitution provision applies to victims of sex trafficking and ensures that the affirmative defense applies to both of the criminal offenses created in the underlying bill. These changes are simple and reasonable, and with that, I support the amendment, and I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 2, printed in House Report 115-583. Purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition? The clerk will designate the amendment.
Report number 115-583, offered by Mrs. Mimi Walters of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 748, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Walters, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my amendment to H.R. 1865, the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. I also want to thank my colleague, Ann Wagner, for her dedication to this issue and her efforts to bring this bill to the floor. The underlying bill will help crack down on online facilitators of human sex trafficking to end this modern-day slavery. My amendment will allow enforcement of criminal and civil sex trafficking laws against websites that knowingly facilitate online sex trafficking activities. Mr. Speaker, this issue is of significant local concern in the heart of my district in Orange County. Last year, a major international sex trafficking ring was uncovered in a quiet Irvine, California neighborhood. Young women from overseas were sold repeatedly through the website Backpage.com. Websites like Backpage, which are essentially storefronts for the facilitation of sex trafficking, have been able to operate with impunity. My amendment, in conjunction with the underlying bill, will help prosecutors crack down on websites that knowingly facilitate or promote sex trafficking while keeping in place safeguards for those who responsibly publish third-party content. This legislation will empower sex trafficking survivors to come forward and seek justice. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill and put an end to human sex trafficking industry in America. And I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise?
To claim the time in opposition.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized by unanimous consent.
Mr. Speaker, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act stands for a very simple, powerful idea that a website should not be liable for the actions of its users. Because of Section 230, we have the Internet as we know it today. And also because of Section 230, the vast majority of websites can safely and effectively report and coordinate with law enforcement on various crimes, including sex trafficking, child pornography, and the like. Unfortunately, Section 230 has been utilized by bad actors, including a notorious one, Backpage, to traffic in children and to exploit victims. Really, they're slavery victims. The underlying bill, this bill, H.R. 1865, puts a stop to that. As the Department of Justice has noted, it will allow for the prosecution of people who are trafficking in victims online. The Walters Amendment, however, for the first time would carve a hole in 230 and make it actually more difficult than the underlying bill to prosecute traffickers online. By creating potential liability for, quote, knowing that a user is using their website for facilitating sex trafficking, the Walters Amendment would create what legal experts call the moderator's dilemma. There's no obligation under law to moderate your website, and in fact, if you have 2 million users or 10 million users, you really don't know what's being posted by your users. But under this amendment, if you made any effort to try and find out what was happening among your users, as many websites do today, especially for child pornography, but also for trafficking, you would incur liability because you would then have a reason to know. Now, other laws that deal with intermediary liability, such as the requirement to report child pornography or copyright safe harbors of the DMCA, have very clear and specific provisions on when a website has sufficient knowledge and what express actions it should take. The Walters Amendment has none of these, and there's no case law on it either. So the amendment really would put web owners in a very weird place. If you do anything to moderate, you're risking liability. The safe incentive would be to not monitor at all. And that would be tragic and a gain for child predators, although I know that that's not the intention. Because you can't stop moderating just for trafficking. You either moderate or you don't moderate. And we do know that there have been tremendous advances for machine-operated filters to find child pornography. Actually, that's one of the easiest things to find using filters, and it's very important that websites cooperate with law enforcement to catch those bad guys. Under the Walters Amendment, the disincentive would be huge not to do that. And I think that's why the Department of Justice does not support the Walters Amendment. As I said earlier, and the chairman put the letter into the record, the department believes that any revision to define participation in a venture is unnecessary, and they say, while well-intentioned, this new language would impact prosecutions by effectively creating additional elements that prosecutors would have to prove at trial. That's why it's a bad idea to adopt this amendment, and as the chairman of the committee has said, Section 4 of the amendment also violates the ex post facto clause of the Constitution by attaching criminal liability to actions that preceded the enactment of the bills. It's clearly unconstitutional. So although I don't have any doubt as to the good intentions behind the offering of this amendment, it would actually impair the ability to protect victims. It would make it more difficult to prosecute, as the Department of Justice has pointed out. And it's something, it didn't go through the Judiciary Committee, and I think that's a major fault, because one of the things we were able to do in the committee, and we did this together on a bipartisan basis, was to sort through the unintended consequences of seemingly simple language. Nothing in writing law is simple, and certainly nobody wants a provision that is going to negatively impact prosecutions, have unintended consequences for state actions, as the Department of Justice has pointed out, and would provide a disincentive for people to moderate activities to try and catch bad guys and to work with law enforcement. So although the intentions are good, the amendment is flawed. I hope we vote no on it, and then I hope we give a resounding unanimous vote yes for the underlying bill. And I see that my time has expired, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to reclaim the time I yielded.
Without objection.
And I'd like to yield to my colleague, Ann Wagner.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for bringing up the Walters Amendment to H.R. 1865, the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, called FOSTA. The Walters Amendment reinstates critical pro-victim provisions from my original bill. It also reflects the work that has been done in the Senate on these provisions, which are the meat of the Senate Bill 1693, the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, or SESTA. FOSTA has over 175 House co-sponsors, and SESTA has over 67 Senate co-sponsors. These two bills depend on each other to address the problems of online sex trafficking. Mr. Speaker, we should not allow big tech, money, and special interests to try and over-define this conversation and override our criminal justice system. FOSTA amends Section 230 to allow for stronger criminal enforcement against websites that profit from human trafficking, and SESTA amends Section 230 to allow for stronger civil enforcement against websites that profit from human trafficking. They are two sides of the same coin, and they must pass together. We need both criminal and civil tools to properly combat the highly lucrative industry of online sex trafficking. Moreover, it is imperative that we clarify that Section 230 does not impair or limit the ability of trafficking victims to use the federal private right of action that Congress clearly provided in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. 2 years ago, the First Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that there is a fundamental tension between this private right of action and Section 230. Today, by voting yes on the Walters Amendment, the House will dispel this tension. No website is immune from civil liability for not knowingly facilitating the sale of trafficking victims. I thank you. Would you yield?
Yes.
Gentlelady yields.
The gentlelady yields. The gentlewoman
I thank the
from Texas is
gentlelady.
recognized.
Very quickly, let me just read. 16-year-old was found beaten, stabbed to death after being advertised as a prostitute on Backpage. I might suggest that we follow one great philosopher in California that said, can we all get along? This amendment is needed in order to give enhanced powers to state attorney generals, that they can provide the extra litigation leverage for individuals who are impacted in a devastating manner. As I said, we have to be concerned about the First Amendment, but we've got to protect our children. And every time I think of this precious young lady, Desiree, and the tears of her mother, who testified before the other body, the Senate hearing, I think it is important that we move forward. We move forward, we can build on this legislation. I intend to offer additional legislation that we will need, all of us working, so that we can put a stop sign in front of the dastardly behavior of online sex trafficking. So I'd ask my colleagues to support the Walters Amendment in order to ensure that we can move forward, and as we move forward, make a difference in the lives of these children. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentlewoman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I'd like the yeas and nays on that amendment.
Does the gentlewoman request a recorded vote?
Yes, I do.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 115-583. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
In House Report Number 115-583, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 748, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Let me thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've already raised the picture of Desiree, who is dead. And it was driven by being exposed as a so-called prostitute, sex trafficking a little girl on Backpage. Or to J.S., who in fact was victimized in Seattle, raped and put on Backpage, rescued by her family, and failed in a court before this legislation. My legislation is very simple. Does this bill work? What more can we do? And so I'm asking for a GAO study that would be instructed, the GAO will be instructed to assess the damages awarded to victims and restitution amounts imposed against defendants as a result of this bill. Victims of sex trafficking require a multifaceted response to rebuild their lives that includes housing, counseling, job training, and in many cases drug treatment and rehabilitation. We as members of Congress need to be able to know, does it work? A citizen-led movement called Fight for Us, along with a team of influential citizens called the Houston 20, work to fill in the gaps and strengthen the services for victims and survivors in the city of Houston. I was very proud to meet with them at the Community of Faith Church, a socially motivated church led by Bishop James Dixon. Jackie is the lead, and they were all committed, Children at Risk and many other organizations, to eliminating some of the gaps for the Houston 20, which will allow them to utilize their resources for even greater work. Does this really work? So I'd ask my colleagues to support the Jackson Lee Amendment, and I reserve my time.
The woman reserves. Purpose does the gentlewoman from Alabama rise?
Ask unanimous consent to claim the time in opposition to the amendment, although I'm not opposed.
Without objection.
I support Mrs. Jackson Lee's amendment requiring a GAO study. It's always helpful to acquire more information on the efficiency of a new law. This study will provide useful information to determine whether this legislation has proven to be the meaningful tool that we anticipate it will be. I commend Ms. Jackson Lee for introducing this amendment and for her commitment to combating sex trafficking, and I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Missouri.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady from Alabama for yielding, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent years, sex trafficking has moved from the streets to the internet. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has witnessed an 846% increase in suspected child sex trafficking reports. 81% of these reports concern online trafficking, facilitated by websites that help traffickers post advertisements of children and victims. I find it hard to imagine that if a neighborhood business hosted a slave auction, the auctioneer would not be considered liable. But that's exactly what is happening with websites like Backpage.com and hundreds of others. I've spoken with state and local prosecutors across America who want to hold online advertisers accountable for facilitating, trafficking, and promoting prostitution, but they cannot. Section 230 has been interpreted so broadly that courts have ruled in favor of Backpage.com in criminal and civil cases, despite the website's clear criminal conduct. These rulings defy congressional intent. 22 years ago, Senator Jim Exon of Nebraska, sponsor of the Communications Decency Act, stated, quote, "The information superhighway should not become a red light district." Section 230 was an amendment to the CDA that intended to motivate websites to screen explicit content in good faith and to shield websites from unfair liability for third-party content. However, Section 230 was never intended to shield websites from liability for criminal conduct. Congress did not intend to allow businesses to commit trafficking crimes online that they could never commit offline. It never meant to imply that criminal conduct can hide behind the defense of legitimate publishing or editing. H.R. 1865 is a long overdue clarification of Section 230, explaining to Americans' courts that state and local prosecutors are not handcuffed from protecting their communities, and that the state laws should be freely enforced against websites that unlawfully promote prostitution and sex. Mr. Speaker, the Lee Amendment will help us track the use of this new crime, and I am delighted to support it. I thank the gentlelady for offering it. Mr. Speaker, I'm horrified that children and adults are sold on the internet like a T-shirt or takeout. I am horrified that human beings are sold with impunity and have no access to justice. Today, please vote yes for justice. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding time.
I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you. How much time do each side have?
3 minutes for Texas, 2 minutes for Alabama.
I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Ohio.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, for yielding time, but more importantly, thank you for your amendment. As the lead Democrat sponsor on this bill, I proudly join you with that amendment. And like my colleague, Congresswoman Roby said, it's always good when you have a great bill that you can have an amendment that asks for a study to make sure that it's effective. Lastly, let me just say to you, thank you for sharing those stories, whether it's the story of Kathy, whether it's the story of Erica, or in my district, Teresa. It makes me proud to stand with you, and I thank you not only for this amendment, but for your work in judiciary, because what we know your amendment will do, it will protect the innocent. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman
Reserve.
from Alabama. The gentlewoman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman
Do
from
you
Texas.
have an additional speaker? Thank you. So I will close at this time. As I indicated, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlelady from Ohio, from New York. I thank the gentlelady, Congresswoman Wagner. I thank Congresswoman Loughran for her concern as evidenced by her statement. But I want to focus on building blocks. And I want to say to Fight for Us and the coalition of 20 that I met with, my promise is that we are in building blocks. We're going to build on what we're doing today, and we're going to continue to mount the assault on sex trafficking and human trafficking, and we're going to literally wipe it out. We're going to wipe it out because of Chandra. We're going to wipe it out because of this young, beautiful lady, 16 years old, Desiree. We're going to wipe it out because of Desiree. We're going to wipe it out because of JS. We're going to wipe it out because Desiree was found beaten and stabbed to death after being advertised as a prostitute on Backpage. We want her mother to know that we are outraged that children are treated in this way. And my amendment will be the guideposts. Is what we're doing working? It will provide a report on the amounts of damages awarded, the restitution awarded, report the amounts that are requested by victims and the government on their behalf, the nature and descriptions of the losses that are claimed and proven, the justification for the amounts that are requested and eventually ordered to be paid. My amendment asks GAO to report cases that are dismissed and provide information to describing the reason for those dismissals. We don't want anything to go under the rug. Our children are too important. So I'd ask my colleagues to support the Jackson Lee amendment. And in conclusion, I would say to those who I met with, to those groups who are around the nation, meeting in local communities, thinking that they're alone, fighting this dastardly act of sex trafficking and human trafficking, and of course, a moneymaker like Backpage, you're not alone. We're starting today. We've done work before, and we are not going to stop. And I will work with you for the ongoing blocks that are going to continue to stamp out sex trafficking, online sex trafficking, and human trafficking. With that, I ask for support of the legislation and my amendment.
Time has
I
expired.
yield back.
The gentlewoman from Alabama.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I support Ms. Jackson Lee's amendment, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes. With that, I yield back.
The question on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Does the gentlewoman from Alabama seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the committee will now rise.
On the motion that the committee rise, all of those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.